So thanks everyone for showing up. We're very excited with the turnout on this. I am excited to introduce to you, sorry, it's going to be a little bit tricky because people are coming in. Dr. Justine Keathley is a registered dietitian with the College of Dietitians of Ontario and an assistant professor in nutrition, exercise, and metabolism at the University of Guelph. I got things popping up on my screen that shouldn't. She has completed her Bachelor of Science and, what's the MSc? Master's in Science, right?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. And she's completed her Master's in Science and a CIHR-funded PhD at Western University, where she led a randomized controlled clinical trial evaluating the impacts of providing genetic information on nutrition, exercise, and health outcomes. She then pursued a CIHR-funded postdoctoral fellowship at University Laval and a visiting postdoc with the Genomics to People Lab at Harvard University and Brigham and Women's Hospital. I just got to admit a couple more. And during her postdoctoral fellowship, Dr. Keathley used various omic technologies to study relationships between genes, nutrition, metabolics, and health, and the inter-individual variations that are observed. In addition to a research experience, Dr. Keathley has many years of experience working as a registered dietitian in a clinical, community, and industry settings. She is now leading a research program at the University of Guelph, which focuses on evaluating potential metabolic and health impacts among carriers of inborn errors of metabolism with a focus on PKU. CanPKU is very excited to bring this talk to you. It's a topic that many of us have thought about for a long time. CanPKU has also worked with Dr. Keathley at the early stages of this trial, and we are with you in anticipation over hearing some of the results and where it will take the community next. I'm going to pass it over to you while I keep admitting people, Justine. We're at 70.
Awesome. Yeah,
Yes,
thank
okay.
you so much for the introduction, and really nice to see a good turnout here today. Like Tanya mentioned, my talk today will be focused on genetic carriers of PKU and trying to dive into this question that I have about whether or not there are certain health and metabolic implications for this population that we currently don't understand. So I gave a similar talk at a CanPKU meeting in Ottawa. It was a couple years back now. And there was a lot of interest, so it's nice to be here today online, hoping to have more of a reach across Canada. And I think we even have some people from other countries joining us as well. So thank you to Tanya and John for having me and setting this up. Before I get started, just a brief funding and conflict of interest statement. So I'll be speaking about the Fee4Me trial. Primarily, and this is being funded by BioMarin Pharmaceutical Incorporated. I personally have no conflicts of interest to disclose. So we're all familiar, obviously, with this condition called phenylketonuria, or PKU for short. Essentially, it's a condition where if individuals are consuming phenylalanine, an amino acid found in protein foods, the conversion of phenylalanine to tyrosine is impaired, and oftentimes as a result of a reduced PAH enzymatic functioning, meaning that people with PKU don't convert phenylalanine to tyrosine very well. And so we see levels of phenylalanine increase and levels of tyrosine drop if they're not following a very specific dietary pattern and also possibly taking medications. And even in individuals with PKU, where their levels of phenylalanine are very well controlled, we still see very high rates of a variety of different conditions, oftentimes being neurological symptoms, seizures, headaches, anxiety, depression, etc. I've listed a number of different symptoms on this slide, and the prevalence of these in individuals who have well-treated PKU is 50 to 90%. So it's very high. In terms of the genetic inheritance of PKU, This is typically what you would see if you were to read a research paper or look this up on Google. And essentially, it's an autosomal recessive inheritance pattern, meaning that both biological parents would have to be carriers for the PKU gene in order to have a child who is affected with PKU. But what's interesting is if we look at this inheritance pattern, we often see that the carriers are described as unaffected. But if we look at older studies that have been done, and I'll go over a few of them just at a really introductory level today, we see that you could actually hypothesize that these carriers may not be unaffected, but instead they might be intermediately affected. And by that, we mean that it's possible for carriers of PKU to present with certain signs, symptoms, disease states that we often see in individuals with PKU, but to a lesser extent. So we call this an intermediate phenotype. Again, essentially those signs and symptoms appearing, but to a much lesser extent in this population. And just to reiterate, this is simply a hypothesis at this point. So there is no research that proves that this is necessarily the case. But based on these earlier studies, our research at the University of Guelph is seeking to look into this further to see whether or not these carriers could potentially be intermediately affected. So in this case, on the slide, we see that it could be siblings of individuals with PKU who are carriers, or their biological parents would be guaranteed to be carriers. But it's also possible that we would see aunts, uncles, grandparents who are carriers of PKU as well. So one of the earliest studies that has been done was from 1975, so many years ago. It was a small sample size, meaning that not a lot of people participated, but it was early evidence that at a metabolic level, something is happening in PKU carriers within that PAH pathway. So they took liver biopsies of individuals with PKU and their parents, so their parents would be the carriers. And they looked at PAH and enzyme activity, so kind of how well that converting factor is at getting phenylalanine to tyrosine. And in those with PKU, they saw that they had up to 5% of normal PAH enzyme activity. But in the PKU carriers, who again are historically described as unaffected, they actually found that they only had 7.3 to 10% of normal PAH enzyme activity. Again, meaning that at a metabolic level, something was not quite right. There's also been some studies where the researchers have given individuals who are carriers for PKU a high phenylalanine meal. In this case, I believe it was a hamburger and a diet pop. And they looked at plasma levels of phenylalanine or blood levels. And we see here, again, the PKU carriers, they had these greater spikes in plasma phenylalanine, or Phe for short, after they consumed that high Phe meal compared to the controls who were non-carriers for PKU. And another early study showing essentially the same thing. So after 33 milligram per kilogram load of phenylalanine, this time just in supplement form, the purple line shows the non-carrier group and the blue line shows the carrier group. And we see that among the carriers, again, higher spikes in Phe, peaking at about 2 hours following Phe consumption. And we've just added this red line to note that mild HbA diagnosis starts at about 120 micromoles per liter. And you can see that those carriers are exceeding that level in this study. For context, 33 milligrams per kilogram of body weight of phenylalanine would be for a 70 kilogram person what you see in this meal. So a relatively large chicken breast, a few French fries, and a salad on the side. So quite possible that somebody could be consuming that level in a meal on a regular basis. In terms of impact on health, this is where we have a lot less research, but essentially if we're looking at those older studies and we're seeing that PAH enzyme activity or that metabolic process is being affected, and we're seeing that in PKU carriers, after consuming phenylalanine, their levels are increasing to a greater extent than non-carriers. It's reasonable to suggest that perhaps something is happening from a health perspective since this metabolic process is being altered. And there is some early evidence pointing to possible cognitive and mental health risks in this population, but those studies have a lot of flaws, so we can't say with 100% certainty that this is the case. Again, I really just touched on some of those earlier studies that have been done. So if anyone's interested in reading more research, I wanted to point to this review article that my PhD student, Sophia Kahn, recently published in Lifestyle Genomics. So maybe we can get a link to this posted somewhere on CanPKU if you're interested in reading those studies in more depth. In a clinical setting, genetic carriers of PKU are still considered to be unaffected. And again, it's because we really don't have the research to show that they necessarily are affected. Like I mentioned, it's really a hypothesis of mine at this point that our studies are trying to answer. But in a clinical setting, we would say they're unaffected. So this would just be anecdotal, but I wanted to hear from you. So based on your personal experience, do you think that carriers of PKU are intermediately affected? So again, meaning that they don't necessarily present with as strong of a phenotype or as severe symptoms, signs, and traits of those who have PKU, but do they present with some lesser degree of those similar signs, symptoms, and traits? So just a straight yes or no, or if you're really not sure, you can say, I don't know, and I'll pull up the results so that we can all look at them. Are you able to see those? I'll assume yes, since I don't.
I can see there's a one answered. Is there more than one already answered?
Yes, there's more than one person has.
You may have to refresh the screen. I'm only seeing one.
Okay, let's see.
We have some people who are also mentioning it in
There we
chat.
go.
So just while that's coming in, we have a yes, we have a not in my experience, not sure, yes, not sure. Please go back to the code. And yes. So the code is also on the bottom left of the screen. If you need to grab that code from there, Steph.
Yeah. And there's the passcode and the number that you'll need to log in as well. Give it a couple more seconds. But essentially, it looks like the vast majority are suggesting yes, that this population could be intermediately affected. Definitely have some saying no, and then a few of I'm not sure. So again, this is really just anecdotal at this point, curious to hear your perspective. As I talk to more and more people in the PKU community, I'm finding that there are a lot of people who perceive that perhaps, yes, this is a population that we should look into more. And that's really been motivating for me in terms of building a research program in this area. All right, so are you able to now see my slides again?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so the main study that we are leading at the University of Guelph is called the Fee for Me trial. I won't read the lengthy title, but essentially it is a clinical trial. It's being led by Sophia Kahn, who again is my PhD student, and Madison Fennell, an MSc candidate in human health and nutritional sciences at the University of Guelph. So I'll speak a little bit to this study and what it's all about. And then I'll talk about some results from a pilot study that we ran for this trial after that. So the Fee for Me trial is the study that's being funded thanks to BioMarin Pharmaceutical Incorporated. And essentially, we are bringing in both genetic carriers and non-carriers of PKU. Looking to recruit 25 carriers and 25 non-carriers. And we want to answer this overarching question: do genetic carriers of PKU have significant differences in their chronic mental health status, focusing on anxiety, depression, and impulsivity, their cognition, mood, blood pressure, and heart rate, both before and after consuming a phenylalanine supplement? And do they have alterations in phenylalanine metabolism? And so we're looking to compare those groups of carriers and non-carriers. In terms of an overview of the study procedures, so we have participants coming into the lab fasted, so not having anything to eat or drink other than water prior to their testing. And we have them run a series of cognitive tasks, looking at things like working memory, executive functioning. We measure blood pressure. We take saliva, urine, and blood samples for evaluating phenylalanine metabolism, and do a few other different baseline tests. Then participants will consume phenylalanine. We mix it with orange juice to help mask the taste of it because it is a very bitter substance. And participants will then wait in the research unit for 2 hours and repeat those cognitive tasks. There's also a mood test, blood pressure, heart rate, and some of those biological samples. And we also take a blood sample to do genetic testing so that participants can find out, if they wish to find out, whether or not they are carriers or non-carriers for PKU. So we don't have results for the full clinical trial at this point. The study is ongoing. We need participants, and so far the PKU community has been absolutely outstanding at helping to support this research. So specifically, we are looking for adults who are at least 18 years of age, both carriers and non-carriers, but not parents of individuals with PKU, since the burden of illness could confound or influence some of our findings that we're looking at. So think adult siblings, grandparents, aunts and uncles, even cousins of those with PKU, but not the parents or caregivers. And again, we will conduct genetic testing to determine carrier status, so they don't need to know whether or not they are a carrier before participating. This study runs at the University of Guelph. So for one morning, usually it runs between about 8 a.m. and noon-ish, but we can start at any time that participants wish to start. So we do provide travel reimbursement up to $100 and a $40 incentive to participate. And then there's some other criteria that will ensure participants meet. If you're interested, I've put my email on the slide for you, and I encourage you to reach out. We appreciate any support that you may be able to give us. So that being said, while we don't have results from the full clinical trial, since we're still bringing participants into the lab, we did run a pilot study that was very similar. The results are just from a small handful of individuals, about 6 people. So the results are preliminary, and in terms of looking at trends in the data, we can't say with a high degree of certainty that this is what we will see in the full clinical trial. So please take these results with a grain of salt, and really they're just to look at possible trends. But I know it was of interest to this group, so we'll go over this study results as well. So again, really similar procedures as the full clinical trial. Participants came in fasted, completed a series of cognitive and mood tasks, had blood pressure measured and a number of biological samples taken. They consumed a relatively high dose of phenylalanine, waited 2 hours in the lab, and repeated those tests. So in terms of mood, it was interesting when we looked at the scores for our PKU carriers compared to non-carriers. The carriers are those in blue. We saw that their mood scores using this POMS questionnaire increased before consuming phenylalanine versus after, 2 hours after, whereas the non-carriers, their scores decreased. So what does this mean? Well, in the PKU carrier population, we saw that consuming this high dose of phenylalanine led to worse mood scores 2 hours following phenylalanine consumption. And in the non-carriers, we saw that their moods actually improved following phenylalanine consumption. Another interesting finding was related to chronic mental health levels, specifically impulsivity. So we use this BIS brief scoring tool, and we saw that among the carriers. So again, this dark blue color, they had higher scores compared to the non-carriers, and this is indicative of the PKU carriers being more impulsive compared to the non-carriers who were less impulsive. This was a chronic measure, so we just look at it at one time point. We don't have data for before versus after phenylalanine consumption. And again, keeping in mind, it was a very small sample size, really just intended to look at the feasibility of running a larger study and see if there's maybe some very preliminary trends we might see in the data. Another interesting finding was related to blood pressure. So once again, this navy blue line is representing our PKU carrier population, whereas the green is representing the non-carriers. And we saw that systolic and diastolic blood pressure, so systolic is your top number, diastolic your bottom, both of those increased in our carrier population, while in the non-carriers, they remained relatively stable, seeing a slight decrease. And then we also monitor side effects during the trial. So this was also interesting to see that the carriers were reporting feeling fatigued, being nauseous, vomiting even, feeling sluggish or heavy, and having headaches, where in our non-carrier group, the only symptom that was reported was feeling fatigued. So I wanted to take a minute to thank all the participants who are making our research possible, and also all of our partners, including CanPKU Plus, who are supporting the recruitment for these studies. If you're interested in supporting our research, but you're not able to physically come to the University of Guelph, we do have another study that's ongoing for PKU carriers and non-carriers. There's no genetic testing for this one. It's simply an online survey. So you would have to know if you're a carrier or non-carrier, but parents of individuals with PKU are included in this study. So if you would like to participate, I've included a QR code to the link, or you can email me if you'd like to learn more about this one. That being said, I wanted to make sure that I left a few minutes to answer any questions that you may have. And if you don't get a chance to ask your questions here, I've also indicated my contact information on this slide. Feel free to reach out at any point if you'd like more information. So I will open the floor and the chat box to questions, and maybe Tanya, if you could
Yeah, for sure.
moderate.
I've kind of been keeping an eye on the questions as we go. Sophia's been very helpful in answering some of them. For those that want the link to the document for the preliminary Are Carriers Unaffected literature review, Brianna was very helpful and put that up in the top of the chat. There's also a quick question of, is your research limited to Canadians, which is kind of fun because usually it excludes us. So is there an opportunity to get involved in the study, or is it for Canadians only?
Yeah, good question. We are not limited to a Canadian population if individuals are willing to travel. We just have a limit to the amount of travel reimbursement that we can give. So it's up to $100 Canadian. So it'd be more likely, I think, that people would be participating in that online survey study, and that is meant to be global. So it's meant to reach people from all over the world and not just Canada.
We also have, remind me why the parents of carriers can't join the first study.
Yeah, good question. So with measuring different outcomes that are related to mental health and mood, being a parent of an individual with PKU obviously is quite burdensome. And so the burden of illness could be confounding some of those results, or I guess a better word for confounding would be like influencing our results. And so if we're excluding that population, then it's more likely that if we see, for example, there's differences in mental health status or changes in mood scores, that it really was as a result of that phenylalanine metabolism, and not that the burden of illness is having an impact, if that makes sense.
So basically that I'm a mom, I'm stressed out because my kid has this rare and all the things I have to do. Therefore, you won't know if I'm stressed out because of that or because of this study.
That's a nice way to put it. Yeah.
Okay. Did you report, or did I miss the fee levels for your preliminary study? Did you show us what they went to?
No, I did not show those on the slide, but they were to be expected, so higher in the carriers versus non-carriers. Sorry, I had to pick and choose in the interest of trying to stay on time.
How would this type of study control for existing diagnosis, if at all, i.e. if a PKU carrier has already been diagnosed with ADHD? So I think that's kind of answering as to why you're not using the parents as carriers. I think that's what's being asked by Heather.
Yeah, so aren't able to control for every single factor. So in this case, we're not controlling for something like an ADHD diagnosis, but it's kind of a tricky one too, because we are, I mean, it's not a direct hypothesis of this study, but we would suspect that possibly among the carriers, you would see higher levels of ADHD compared to non-carriers. That's a component of the online survey study, but not part of this clinical trial, but maybe included in a future study.
That's kind of why we're doing this, is to find that stuff out.
Yeah.
So did you note variance from testing, and if more classic versus milder maybe made a difference?
Yeah, very good question. So in the pilot study, we did not have the exact variance. We just knew if they're carriers or non-carriers. In our full clinical trial, we are going to stratify or basically group individuals based on if they're carrying a variant for classic PKU versus more mild. Those results will be fairly preliminary as well, since we just have 25 carriers, but it will be used to then hopefully inform another study down the road where perhaps, we only look at carriers of classic PKU or vice versa.
Thank you. We may go over time, so if anyone needs to go, we understand. This will be recorded, so all the questions that are here will be answered in the recording. Just want to throw that out because we have 2 minutes left. So what if your child is almost 60? So
Yes, good question. They would still be excluded because we are excluding everyone who is a parent or a caregiver. But you would still be able to or eligible to participate in that online survey instead.
So your child doesn't matter the age, the same rules apply.
But yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Another dietitian is asking, how do you choose the amount of feed that was given in the study?
Good question. So we went with a relatively high dose based on what studies had done previously, essentially. So with that, we'll look at what our findings are. And then my thought is down the road, if we do see something interesting at this higher dose, we would then look at a lower dose and try to figure out if we see the same sort of outcomes.
Perfect. I'm just going through here. So Brianna, thank you for keeping up with adding in the links here that people need. I appreciate that. She is also kind of answering in the comments where she can. So I'm just kind of making sure we're not asking the same question. So someone's asking, I went to an NPKUA webinar that discussed how blood phenylene levels did not directly correlate to phenylene in the cerebral spinal fluid. It varied among individuals. Could this also affect blood nutrition?
Sorry, what was the second part of that question? Or I guess the last sentence, last part that you said.
Could it affect the outcome of this study? The fact that the levels in the blood are not the same as the levels in the cerebral spinal fluid.
Yeah, good question. So the dried blood spots would be our most accurate measure in terms of looking at the phenylalanine, tyrosine levels and related metabolites. We're looking at also saliva and urine to try to evaluate, again, kind of at a preliminary level, whether or not those could be used as surrogate markers to the blood Phe levels.
If carriers have one normal gene for PAH, how would the PAH activity be impaired? And you can answer that, but I think we're kind of looking at that's.
Yes, so that's what we are trying to figure out is if a carrier has a certain variant, yeah, is there going to be a metabolic perturbation? And if so, does that correlate with some sort of alteration in health outcome or a sign or a symptom? Sorry, Tanya, I think you were muted for that one.
I did get muted. How would you prevent bias when participants know that they are a carrier?
Good question. I think that's one of the limitations of the study. I mean, most of the participants that we've had so far did not know if they were a carrier or a non-carrier, but definitely it's possible that people may know, and that could become a source of bias. So it's a limitation for sure.
And when would there be a final conclusion to the study, and where would we be able to find that?
Oh, great question. I mean, I'll be sure to keep CanPKU updated as we go. We're hoping that we would bring in our last 40 participants throughout 2025. So we're aiming to have our data collection done by the end of the year. From there, we have to analyze and publish. So it could be a few years out at this point. But again, once we have results, I could perhaps give another webinar to CanPKU if they'd have me, and we can keep
Always.
everyone appraised.
Yeah, we will always bring you back. We'll post anything that Dr. Keathley sends to us. It'll get posted on the website. And our new
Thank you.
website is coming, and it's much more easy to search for documents. So for the fee levels, are you able to report more details, like roughly how much higher and around what level? Also, does the study design help control for bias, which has already been answered, and include data other than self-reported data for people that are known carriers?
So for I assume that you're talking about the fee for me trial in terms of the
I
self-reported
so.
data or the survey. I'm not sure. The survey is completely self-reported. The fee for me trial has both self-reported data and data that we are measuring. And sorry, what was the first question? I feel like that was a three-parter.
Sorry, a lot of feedback. Someone's not on mute. So for the fee levels, are you able to report more details, like roughly how much higher and around what level they went to?
Oh, yeah, I don't have those here today, but we're in the process of publishing our pilot study data. So again, I can send that out to CanPKU once we have that.
And let me see if we're at the bottom. No, we're not. This is awesome. Thank you. We agree, John. It's a phenomenal, so interesting, so exciting. I did have a question come to me through my phone from someone that was asking, do you have any ties to PKU? What brought you to PKU?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I don't have any personal ties to PKU. My background as a clinician and as a researcher was just in the field of nutritional genomics as a whole. And during my postdoc, I met Robin Heister, who is a medical doctor out of the States, and she's a mom with a kid who has PKU, and we were just chatting and we were reading some research, and it really just sparked my interest in the whole topic. So I think that's really what started it. And then once I started at the University of Guelph and I was building my research program, it's just an area that I felt would be very meaningful to contribute to. And so here we are.
And your original participants, are they able to join in this study, or is that like a one and done?
The original participants from the pilot study,
Yes.
if they meet the eligibility criteria, because that has changed slightly with now having to exclude the parents and caregivers. But if they met eligibility criteria, they could participate again. Yes, there'll be separate data analyses for those two.
Perfect. I'm not seeing any other questions in chat. If anyone has any other questions, you are welcome to send them to myself at info@CanPKU is the easiest email address. And I can get them off to Justine, or her email is also on the screen if you want to get to her directly.
Wonderful. Maybe I'll just finish by saying thank you to everyone in this PKU community for your ongoing support and interest in this research. And I'm happy to hop on a call or answer questions via email if there's anything that you found particularly interesting, or if you have any feedback about the studies that we're running. And thank you to CanPKU Plus again for all your support.
I'm seeing Brianna has a question hand up. Thank you, Brianna, for using that feature.
One of the participants had accidentally sent me a question instead. My wife has classical PKU. We have 3 sons, all healthy. However, 2 of our sons have anxiety disorders, one with obsessive compulsive disorder. Any studies being done on children?
Yeah, good question. At this point, I'm not familiar with any studies that are being done on children who are carriers of PKU, but again, it's a population that our research program at Guelph is interested in looking at in the future. So I can keep you appraised or reach out periodically, and I can let you know if there's anything we get going on.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Justine, but these three would be ideal candidates because they're not PKU parents, but they are carriers.
Yeah. Yes, if they were adults, as long as they're 18 years and over, they'd be eligible for this, the Fee4Me study, provided they meet other criteria as well.
I know the family, so I think it was safe that okay, I'm not seeing anything else. So we will absolutely bring Justine back for, Dr. Keathley back for any updates as they come along, because this is very exciting for CanPKU Plus as well. So watch for more webinars as she has more information. Thank you so much, Dr. Keathley, for your time and your information and your dedication to research for PKU community.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Shout out to Sophia and Madison, who are leading the Fee4Me trial.
Yes,